On the coldest nights of the year, a locomotive cab stays warm for one strange reason. The crew has no heater at all, and the only thing keeping them from freezing is the giant engine refusing to shut off. There is no furnace behind the seats, no thermostat on the wall, just waste heat bleeding off a diesel engine the size of a small room. And that single fact explains almost everything about how railroading survives a deep freeze, from why the engine can never be turned off to a hidden valve designed to dump 200 gallons of water straight onto the ground. Stick with me, because the answer is stranger than you'd ever guess. Start with the thing that surprises people most. A freight locomotive doesn't have a dedicated heating system for the people inside it. There's no separate furnace, no independent cabin heater like the one in your house. Instead, the crew relies entirely on heat thrown off by the massive engine itself, and it works almost exactly like the heater in your car, just scaled up to enormous proportions. At the heart of the machine sits the prime mover, a diesel engine with 12 to 16 cylinders, producing thousands of horsepower. That engine runs so hot, it would destroy itself without constant cooling, so more than 200 gallons of coolant circulate through it at all times, just to keep it from melting down under its own power. Here's the clever part. A portion of that hot coolant gets diverted straight into the cab, routed through a compact heater core, tucked into the structural pillars of the locomotive. An electric blower fan pushes cabin air across that hot metal, and the warmth radiates out into the crew's workspace. It's the same principle as your car's heater, engine heat you would otherwise throw away, redirected to keep people comfortable. But that comfort is not the point. In this system, a warm cab is a lucky side effect of keeping a giant engine alive. If the engine stops, the heat stops with it. And on a night at 40 below, that's not an inconvenience. It's a genuine emergency. That same loop of hot fluid does double duty too, because it also runs through a heat exchanger that warms the incoming diesel fuel. In extreme cold, untreated diesel thickens into a waxy gel that clogs the filters and starves the cylinders, so the engine's own heat is what keeps its fuel flowing. A warm cab is worthless if the fuel has turned to sludge and the engine can't run. So that raises the obvious question: why not just fix all of this with a simple splash of antifreeze, the way you would in a car? This is where locomotives do something that sounds almost reckless. For decades, North American railroads have filled their engines not with glycol antifreeze, but with plain treated water, and they've done it on purpose. It comes down to a cold, calculated trade-off. Antifreeze has one catastrophic failure mode. If it develops an internal leak and seeps into the crankcase where the engine oil lives, glycol destroys the oil's ability to lubricate. It quietly ruins the bearings and can wreck the entire prime mover before anyone notices. A water leak, by comparison, is messy but survivable, and it will not silently eat your engine from the inside. On top of that, clean water actually carries heat, noticeably better than a glycol mix, which keeps the engine cooler under heavy load. So, for the people who maintain these fleets, the math was simple. They'd rather manage the constant, visible threat of freezing than gamble on a silent chemical leak destroying a multi-$100,000 engine. But that choice comes with a hard consequence, and it's the key to this whole story. If your engine is cooled by plain water, you absolutely cannot let it shut down and cool off in freezing weather. Because the moment that water stops moving and drops below 32 degrees, it freezes. And freezing water expands with enough brute force to crack a solid steel engine block. So to survive the cold, the locomotive has to stay awake. Crews often idle the engine at a higher than normal setting, a notch or two up on the throttle, specifically to push the coolant around faster and generate more baseline heat. The engine essentially runs all night, not to go anywhere, but to keep itself from freezing to death. And railroads plan for the worst case too, because sometimes an engine fails anyway. To stop a dead engine from cracking on a frozen night, engineers built in a last-ditch mechanical failsafe at the lowest point of the cooling system. a self-acting drain sometimes called an Ogons valve. It has no computer and no electronics. It simply watches the water temperature. And if that temperature falls to around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, the valve snaps open on its own and dumps every last gallon of coolant straight out onto the track ballast below. Think about how dramatic that is. The machine would rather bleed 200 gallons of water onto the ground than let it freeze inside the block. It's a deliberate sacrifice. Losing the water is cheap and fixable. A cracked engine block is a catastrophe. When the choice is between the two, the valve chooses the flood every time. Now here's the twist that catches almost everyone off guard, and it goes right back to the title. If you walked past a freight train parked in a frozen yard at midnight, engine rumbling, you'd probably assume the crew is curled up asleep inside that warm cab. They're not, and legally, they can't be. Under federal hours of service law, freight crews are strictly limited in how long they can work, and once they hit that ceiling, they're required to get a solid block of undisturbed rest. Crucially, that rest is not allowed to happen in the locomotive cab. The railroad has to transport them off the train entirely, to hotels or designated terminals with real beds, food, and lodging. So the warm, idling cab isn't a bedroom for the road crew. It's a workspace they legally have to leave. So who actually does sleep out on the rails on the coldest nights? Two very specific groups. The first is maintenance of way crews, the workers who repair and rebuild the tracks themselves. Because their job keeps them far from any town, they live in mobile bunk cars, sometimes called camp cars, parked right beside the active line. And federal safety rules govern those spaces tightly, right down to a hard noise ceiling. The sleeping quarters cannot exceed a set decibel level, specifically so exhausted crews can actually rest through the night. The second group is the onboard staff of long-distance passenger trains who sleep in dedicated dormitory cars. And keeping those cars warm at 40 below is its own battle. The heating evolved from primitive coal stoves to diesel-fired oil heaters to modern all-electric systems drawing power straight from the locomotive up front. That power connection is life or death. If a dormitory car loses its heat feed in extreme cold, the temperature crashes so fast that frost will literally creep up the inside walls within hours, turning a steel shelter into an icebox. So when we talk about crews sleeping on the coldest nights, this is who's really out there, and this is the delicate web of heat and power keeping them alive. Of course, keeping all these engines idling through the winter isn't free, far from it. A big road locomotive burns roughly 4 to 5 gallons of diesel every single hour just sitting there idling, going nowhere. Multiply that across a fleet of hundreds of active units running all winter, and it climbs into millions of gallons and millions of dollars drained straight out of the budget. So why do railroads willingly eat that cost? Because the alternative is so much worse. Shut a water-cooled locomotive down in sub-zero cold, let the block freeze and crack, and you are not out a few gallons of fuel, and you are facing a full engine rebuild that can cost tens of thousands of dollars in parts and specialized labor, plus weeks of the locomotive sitting dead instead of earning. Set the steady, predictable cost of idle fuel against the sudden, brutal cost of a shattered engine, and idling wins every time. Burning fuel to stay warm was always the cheaper, safer bet. But that old math has been shifting. As diesel prices climbed, burning 4 gallons an hour to babysit a single engine got a lot harder to swallow across a fleet of tens of thousands of units. Then came tighter emissions rules cracking down on diesel pollution, and communities living next to rail yards who were fed up with the endless low rumble and the exhaust drifting into their neighborhoods all winter. Regulators in both the US and Canada started capping how long a locomotive is even allowed to idle, sometimes to as little as 30 minutes. Keeping the engine warm still made perfect engineering sense, but suddenly it was neither cheap nor socially acceptable, and railroads needed another way. The oldest answer was refreshingly low-tech, sheets of steel. Before computers, crews bolted winterization hatches and snow shields right onto the locomotive body. In summer, the radiator fans blasted hot air straight up and out. But in winter, a mechanic would flip a heavy internal damper inside the hatch, redirecting that stream of engine-warmed air back down over the vulnerable piping and fuel lines, instead of venting it to the sky, using the engine's own waste heat to fight the freeze. Other shields simply blocked fine, dry snow from being sucked into the air intakes. Crude, manual, and effective, these barriers were the frontline defense for decades before modern electronics quietly retired most of them. The bigger leap was the auxiliary power unit, or APU, and the idea is elegant. Instead of running a 16-cylinder monster all night just to make heat, railroads bolt on a tiny second engine, sometimes no bigger than what you would find in heavy lawn equipment, sipping as little as half a gallon of fuel an hour. That little engine's whole job is to pump hot water through the big engine's block to keep it from freezing, while also trickle charging the batteries so the main engine can fire up instantly when it's needed. The savings are real. One regional railroad's winter trial reportedly saved over 100,000 gallons of diesel across just a handful of locomotives in a single season. The catch is that an auxiliary power unit is a second engine, with its own filters and belts and maintenance, and it only helps while the train is parked. The moment the locomotive is actually pulling freight, the main engine has to shoulder the entire heating load again. The most modern fix skips extra hardware entirely and uses software, automatic engine start-stop. A computer acts like a tireless sentry, constantly watching the engine's vital signs: oil temperature, coolant temperature, battery charge, brake line air pressure. When everything is healthy and warm, it shuts the big engine down to save fuel. The instant the coolant cools toward danger or the batteries dip too low, it automatically fires the engine back up to restore heat. It's clever, but it isn't magic, and this is where the human element comes roaring back. That system depends entirely on healthy batteries to crank a cold engine, and it asks a crew to trust that the machine will actually restart when the cabin is plunging toward freezing. For generations, railroaders lived by a single ironclad rule: never shut down a warm engine in a blizzard. Out in the isolation of a northern winter, miles from the nearest town, a failed restart isn't an inconvenience, it's life-threatening. The cabin becomes an icebox, the coolant dumps onto the ballast, and help is a long way off. Overcoming that survival instinct takes more than a fuel-saving spreadsheet. It takes trust, earned slowly, in a system whose failure is absolute. So what comes next? The cleanest answer is to remove the water-cooled engine from the equation altogether. Battery electric locomotives, carrying enormous energy storage packs, have no water-jacketed block to crack, so the whole nightmare of a catastrophic freeze simply vanishes. And in the yards, railroads are increasingly plugging parked locomotives into shore power, external electricity that circulates warm water through a standing engine, letting the main prime mover shut off completely without any risk of freezing. But none of this changes overnight. These machines are built to last 40 years or more, and thousands of legacy water-cooled diesels will stay the backbone of freight for decades. For those old workhorses, the ancient winter choice between idling and draining is still a nightly reality. So the next time you see a locomotive rumbling in a frozen yard, remember it isn't idling out of waste or laziness. It's a machine running all night to keep its own blood from freezing solid, to keep its fuel flowing, and, as a fortunate side effect, to keep the humans depending on it from freezing too. The cold never yields, and neither can the network. That quiet rumble is the sound of a system that has spent a century learning exactly how to survive the deep freeze. If this changed the way you think about those idling engines in the dead of winter, do me a favor and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel keep making these deep dives, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What's the coldest weather you've ever had to work or travel through? Drop it below, and I'll see you in the next one.